Let all these girls in. Make sure my soul is on Do Not Disturb. Jesus. Okay, so welcome everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started since we're 3 minutes beyond the half hour. As you all know, I'm Dr. Anansi Wilson, Associate Professor of Constitutional and Criminal Law, and also the founding director for the Center for the Study of Black Life in the Law. Now, before all of you logged in, you got an email from Eventbrite also explaining and making clear that all of the opinions and the arguments and the things that you hold here are not reflective of any of our individual institutions, whether we're talking about Mitchell Hamline School of Law or the institutions of the folks that are on this call, or the Center for the Study of Black Life in the Law. We're accessing and we're engaging in academic freedom, and we're hoping to help you explore things as we explore those things ourselves. So with that being said, we are here to discuss the state of Black and Black queer life in the law through a BlaQueer lens. All of my panelists are folks that I know and have known for years and look up to and am inspired by, and more importantly, challenged and loved up and down and critiqued by. Hallelujah. And so with that, what we're going to do for our plan today is we're going to allow each person to introduce themselves, and we'll come back around the loop, and each person will give a 5 to 10 minute expose on their notion of the state of Black queer life in the law, how the law is ordering or disordering Black queer living and dying in a way that's very expansive, in a way that you probably have not heard before in your law school, in your university classes, whether it's undergrad and high school, wherever you're coming from, or even in your practice, right, your community organizing or storytelling practice. So as you might know right now, you can tell that you are muted because some folks don't know how to act. So when we get to the question and answer area, you can raise your hand or you can put your question in the chat or the Q&A function at the bottom, and we will try our best to get to you. I'm gonna keep it real. There's 45 of y'all in here right now. There's 180 something people registered. So we're gonna need you to keep the questions concise and impactful so we can get through the evening. And with that, I turn it to you, Dr. Pelaez Lopez.
Hi, everybody. My name is Alan, and I'm really excited to be in this digital space with you. I primarily work at the intersections of undocumented migration, Black aliveness, and trans studies. And to answer the question, what is the state of Black queer life and the law? A lot of my work is with folks who have been detained in either immigrant detention centers, federal prisons, or local county jails who are undocumented. And oftentimes the law forces Black folk into non-consensual performance contracts, which means that Black folk who are detained, particularly queer and trans Black migrants, are demanded to narrate their lives in a very particular way in order to apply for political asylum or refugee status. Queer and trans folk are demanded to denounce their country of birth as an unlivable place, which makes Latin America, the Caribbean, and continental Africa continue to look like an uninhabitable geography. The law also requires that folks pledge allegiance to the US and say, if I get refugee status or political asylum status, I will join the military. So it forces queer and trans Black migrants to kind of adapt this pro-nationhood rhetoric in order to be kind of offered refuge. And when this happens, what is attacked is not only like the body of queer and trans Black migrants, but also their imaginations, in the sense that in order to ask for safety in the US, Black aliveness, trans aliveness, and queer aliveness needs to be shrunk because a lot of Black migrants are Indigenous. And for example, Indigenous communities practice different forms of kinship structures. Some Indigenous communities practice polyamory and polygamy, and those things are illegal in the United States, especially polygamy. So what happens when an Indigenous Black person comes to the US and asks for asylum or refugee status? Their kinship structure is criminalized. Other ways in which our imaginations, I say ours because I was undocumented in the US for almost 20 years. I'm no longer undocumented, and I think that's always important to bring into the space. Another thing that happens is that the law infringes on how immigrant rights organizers work. For example, a lot of the asks from the immigrant rights movement are anti-Black asks, such as the ask of like, immigrants get the job done. It assumes that there is a demographic in the US that doesn't get the job done, and that demographic is Black Americans. It's also ableist in the sense that immigrant rights organizers often use talking points like, oh, immigrants are hard workers, and then it puts the migrant as a body that is only useful for capitalism, which then prevents queer and trans Black futures, but overall Black futures. And oftentimes we don't talk about anti-Blackness inside immigrant detention centers because the way that the law works is that it forces folks who are inside detention centers to narrate themselves on the basis of good moral character. So non-Black undocumented migrants will narrate their existence in opposition to Black undocumented migrants inside detention centers. So that's another way in which the law prevents queer and trans Black futures by forcing non-Black migrants to narrate themselves against queer and trans Black migrants. I'll stop it at that, just so that we can get the panel going.
Yeah, no, very good. Thank you. That is so much food for thought. I was taking a lot of notes over here. So let me move on over here to Mycall. I'm going to pronounce your name right the next time, Michael. There you go. Go ahead and take it away.
Hi, y'all. Super happy to be with you. My name is Mycall Akeem Riley. I use Indian pronouns, and I am the director of the Gender and Sexuality Center for Queer and Trans Life at the University of Minnesota on Cities campus. First off, I just have to say that all the folks who I'm on this conversation with are work that I think a lot about and has informed me in a variety of ways. So just first and foremost, thanks for being Black, queer, and thinking in a world that doesn't make that really easy. A lot of the work I get to do is around creating spaces for students in particular to hopefully thrive. I think it's very difficult for them to do such in these spaces. I know that we'll talk more, but I've been thinking a lot about what it means in a container like the institutions of higher education, the way that laws interact with them, affirmative action, things of that nature. Being in Minnesota, which is a trans refuge state, and what that now means has been really complicated and nuanced. I'll tell one story really quickly. In March, there was an incident in Minnesota where a Black trans woman was attacked on the light rail system. Two folks beat her up, trigger warning, she's alive, but it was a very violent space. And that happened in February. And then in March is when we kind of had a celebration for Minnesota now being a trans refuge state. And people were just like very excited about this. And so I was doing something in my office, I don't know, in between things, and my phone rang, and I never get phone calls. It's like the second time my office phone has rang. I'm oftentimes not in here unless it's a Tuesday or a Thursday, to be honest. But anyway, the phone rings, and I don't remember exactly who it was. I think I was so taken aback by it ringing that I just was like, hello. And it was someone from somewhere in the university, and they were like, what are we doing to celebrate the trans refuge state? Like, this law has been signed, we need to have a celebration, let's get cake, let's do all the things. And I remember talking with this individual, and I won't belabor the conversation for too long, but sitting here having this conversation with them, and they're just going on about how they've never thought we'd see a world like this, and how this is going to change so many things for so many people. And I remember listening to them, and because that's, I want to be clear, I work for an institution of higher education. I don't want to act as if I don't. I don't want to act as if I'm not informed and a part of this system, even if I hope for and strive to build a different one. So I listened to them because that's my job. And I was like, I hear you, I celebrate all that, but did you know what happened just a month ago about it? Literally a month ago, this Black trans woman was hurt, and what does a trans refuge state mean for someone like that? What does it mean for when we live in a state where we have this, this call that it's going to be safe, right, for trans folks, particularly thinking about Black, brown, and Indigenous trans folk, particularly thinking about Black trans people? What does that mean when we have all this talk of that? But on the light rail, this individual was attacked. The folks who attacked her, I think only are going to be in jail for like a year. Not that I'm invested in prisons, but like that's what they're getting. And I think that, I don't know, I spend a lot of time feeling very convoluted and complicated into what it means for me to be in that space, to hold the identities that I have as a Black queer person myself, creating spaces for Black queer students in a state like Minnesota, knowing that that's some of the things that we're up against. And it just, I don't know, I'm struck by the question. I've been like writing and thinking and just like sitting with that quite a bit. And I don't know, I'm sure we'll talk more. I have more things to say, but that's a little, I guess, appetizer for what I hope we can get into.
I love a good old appetizer. So thank you for that. And also thank you for, bringing up the kind of local and the kind of corporeal, right? I think that sometimes we forget to talk about the body and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but also the rhetorics of safety, right? Safety for whom? And the notion of safety requires a particular type of assumption of violence and who should be violated. And I mean, even when you kind of talked about the prison and jails, your non-investment in that, right? The notion of safety creates a logic for those things. So I think it's important that you tease those out in the moment. And we'll come back to those questions a little bit later. Dr. Jackson.
Good evening, everyone. I'm so happy to be here with you all. Thank you for inviting me. I think this is such an important conversation, especially in this political moment. So I'm grateful to be here. So I come at this conversation as a social scientist, as a political scientist, and when I read the question, what is the state of Black life and the law, and through a Black queer lens, I was thinking, there are so many states of Black queer life, and I turned immediately to the conversations I have with young Black people in the interviews I've been conducting since 2018, because I refuse to speak on behalf of Black folk without listening to or speaking to Black folk. And what I witnessed and what I encounter so much in those conversations are two, I would say, kind of dominant states, and there are states of antagonism and states of reclamation. And when I started the interviews in 2018 with young Black folks in Chicago, there was this overwhelming sense that there was that the law, that the state, their orientation to the law, that being police, that being education, that being any system that has been flattened, right? When we talk about the state as an institution, we're not saying that there isn't, local, federal, and state, authorities. We're saying that the way that the federal government, the national government functions is to flatten all of those powers so that they can act in concert to harm, right? Because they have a legal justification, right, in the eyes of many, to do violence. And so when I talk to young people about the state and their orientation to the law, there's this sense that they are being antagonized, right? That they are being surveilled, chased, harmed, that there is this kind of intervention into their lives that they have no desire to engage with, no desire to embody and experience. And when I talk to young Black folk in Chicago, on the South Side in particular, they would describe the law, they would describe the state as a nuisance in their life, right? These kind of infantilizing orientation, this kind of patriarchal notion of the law to treat Black folks as if we are incapable of taking care of ourselves, if we are not the experts on our own lives, as if we are not the holders of all the knowledge and resources that we need in order to survive and thrive. And so this state of antagonism I saw as COVID proceeded and the pandemic spread, it changed to this kind of resistance and an orientation toward reclamation that was about removing oneself from these kind of states of vulnerability, these kind of moments of contact. I would talk to young people in 2021 and 2022, and they would tell me about all these kind of red flags and these landmines that they would see that would tell them, I don't belong over there, right? Oh, I saw a MAGA hat, and I'm just like, I'm not going to that restaurant. I saw a certain flag on someone's truck, and I'm just not coming into that neighborhood anymore, right? And the ways that young Black folks are telling me about how they are just removing themselves from these spaces because they have a right to, right? They have a right to reject. They have a right to refusal, right? And I'm really excited. I'm so excited about refusal, right? I'm so excited about refusal as a type of reclamation that we embrace collectively, right? Because I think for so long, the state of Black life and the law has been a state of acceptance, that we just have to take whatever we can get, that every incremental change is good enough because at least it's one step closer. And what young people have told me is actually it's not good enough. And I don't have to accept it. I don't have to accept crumbs, and they can do better. And until they do, I'm not going to participate, right? And I find that so powerful and so beautiful. And I find it so self-kind and so self-gracious, you know, for folks to collectively orient themselves so that their preservation and their thriving is actually central to their political and philosophical ethos. And I think that's the state of Black life and the law. I think it's an orientation to refusal to take anything and to only accept what they deserve.
Yeah, no, I love that because I mean you're making us think about it in kind of two ways. Obviously, as you point out, antagonism, but also this type of refusal and resistance. And we don't often kind of think about the law itself, like as you have, as a type of imposition, right? As a type of ongoing trespass, right? The law as trespass, the law as violation, the law as debilitator, the law as a type of libel and defamation, right? And the law as a type of non-consensual sexual encounter as well, if we get into Essex Hemphill a little bit in Audre Lorde. But I'll save that for a little bit later. I just want to pull that out because you were giving us some things. And I just want to kind of, again, underscore the first thing you said about the importance of listening to Black folk to be able to speak and think with Black folks, not on behalf, not as a spokesperson, but with and alongside on this particular type of journey. And the importance of bearing witness, right? In order to bear witness, you first have to listen. So I think that's really, really important, and not reinterpret, actually just to repeat sometimes. So that's a very beautiful thing. Thank you, Dr. Jackson. Dr. Kevon Camilla Glover, give it to us.
Hi, everybody. Dr. Julian, Kevon, Camilla Glover. Thank you to Dr. Wilson for the invitation to come. Thank you to fellow panelists. You've already took a number of my points, so I'll speak about what remains. And for me, in answering this question about the state of Black life, you know, one of the biggest things I think that for me and my loved ones that Black life has really taught me, it goes back to something we were just talking about, right? And that is this idea of safety, right? The idea of safety for me and for many people I know is little more than an illusion or a ruse is the language that I like to use to describe it, right? It's something that, you know, that we attempt to make real, and what we don't often recognize is that what makes safety real, right? It requires a kind of violence, right? And for me, thinking in community with so many folks, I'm really taken by a particular idea. Now, I'll come right out and say that while I am not an avowed Afro-pessimist, you know, my orientation to the world as a Capricorn is one of dutiful suspicion. So the way that manifests in my work and the way I'm thinking is through, you know, what are the structuring kind of logics or structuring dialogics that that exist in our lives, right? And it still adopts the society, Western societies in general, adopt the binary kind of structure, right? Where we are forced to choose to be this or that. And they're based, you know, the primary purpose is for surveillance. And it is also based on a gross reduction of complexities and contradictions that we all embody and have, right? And again, it structures violence in these ways. And I take from Frank Wilderson, he has this article about the master-slave relation, where they're theorizing the three constitutive elements of this relationship. And the three elements are gratuitous violence being done to Black bodies all over the world, at any time, for any reason. Natal alienation, going back to what Professor Pelaez Lopez was talking about the kinship structures that Black folks have. And natal alienation is one that has come to dismantle that. And the third is really this kind of general dishonor, where before, during, and after we are alive, our legacies, our memories, and our bodies are subject to a kind of ongoing violence that, Wilderson names a kind of general dishonor. So that's, I think, really important to kind of structure this conversation. And, while it might sound really pessimistic, and I'm definitely a realist, I'm definitely not an optimist, y'all. So sorry about that if you thought this was going to be optimistic, but I really dwell in the realm of the real. And for me, what I'm thinking then about the stake, what is at stake for the work that I'm doing in community, the writing that I'm doing, the things that I'm creating with folks. And for me, that allows me right now to think about what are the freedom practices that Black folks use to navigate this world under a constant state of duress. Right. And so the book project that I'm working on right now thinks about three main freedom practices. One being multiplicity, right? The second being transmutation, and the third being critical non-monogamy, right? We could talk a little bit more about that, but I'll leave it there. I just want to give you all a kind of framing of how I come to this conversation. So thank you.
Yes, Dr. Glover always giving me, a lot to think about, my good sister. So I want to just underscore some things you were saying before I also go back to Dr. Alan Pelaez and think about some of what they were saying earlier on. But you kind of underscored some things. Jenn was also thinking about this idea of safety as a ruse, safety as requiring a particular type of violence, and this notion, right, even with safety as it is an type of entitlement to legitimate violence, right? It's to say safety requires to say that my violence must be legitimized by the state because I must have safety, whereas your violence is a violation, right, of my claims to safety. And you kind of went and you've talked about the kind of structuralist nature of violence and then how violence is structured in and of itself, and you're kind of getting up the question is, what does violence and safety make way for? And then thinking about, of course, Wilderson, this notion of general dishonor. And for those of you, I see a lot of my critical race theory students here and all of my Black Lives Matter and the law, right? We're chasing Black lives in the law notions here. And when we're thinking about whiteness as property, right? Well, Cheryl Harris is having us think about the privilege of whiteness as a type of good reputation, right? And so Wilderson and Harris, as much as they probably will never get along, are talking about the same things, right, in different languages. So it's important to kind of think about what is Afro-pessimism doing over here, but also what is critical race theory and really Black feminisms doing over here, even though there's this type of interesting tension, which we can get into earlier. And then lastly, you were kind of talking about what is praxis? How is praxis? What is community? Is community a verb? Is it a noun? Is it a thing that is continually being made in the ways in which you engage with the world? And personally, I'll just say, for me, and I mean, you and I have talked about this, and Dr. Jackson, we talked about this as well, but when I was in law school, I was thinking about dropping out at Howard because I was like, this is anti-Black and homophobic, and baby, y'all are telling me this is what the law is, and I've been Black and poor for a long time, and I know that ain't my right. I know that's a lie. And so what I would do is I used to go over to Frederick Douglass's house in DC and jump over the fence at night and sit over there and read and have me a little glass of bourbon, because I was reminded, right, of the type of freedom struggle that Douglass engaged with just to be in that space. And when he did get a little reputation, when he did get a little bit of coin, right, he buys up all of Anacostia to make sure that the Black people that are free and poor there, right, can go eat from his apple orchard, right, can eat from his farm, right? So there's a type of ancestry of not just being in community, but creating and feeding and nurturing community from one's own essence. And I think you're hinting at both from a Douglass, but an Ida B. Wells, that we can talk a little bit about that later on. And so Alon, I wanted to get at what you were talking about earlier on about kind of what it means. We were talking about the kind of protest earlier in our kind of pre-conversation about folks whose bodies are on the line, right, rhetorically. We were talking about some of our white allies will say, hey, we're protesting this week. Our bodies are on the line. Don't worry, when in fact, it's almost always already, right, Black and Black queer people and trans folk and non-binary folks. And when I say Black queer, I mean all of us, whose bodies are actually being taken up, not just on the line, but across the line into detainment, across the line into violations, both of our borders, of integrity of our bodies, but also, as you were talking about being undocuqueer, against these kind of borders, right, of legality, these kind of borders of safety and refuge. And you mentioned again, right, the ways in which anti-Blackness and what I've called furtive Blackness, but also this kind of criminality, becomes a necessary tool for other undocumented people of color and undocumented white folks to a lesser extent. It becomes the passport for their entry. So there becomes a ways in which you cannot deny anti-Blackness because you need it to grease the wheels to be present. Otherwise, you face certain death or racial sexual terror or the kind of modern day lynchings or separations from your children, right? And so I just wanted to bring that back to you. And I mean, we can go in any order, but I know I didn't comment on what you were saying earlier on. I just want to give you the floor to think through that.
Thank you so much. I think that when you kind of like brought that up, it reminded me again of what Dr. Jackson was saying about refusal. I think that one of the clearest ways that I've witnessed refusal when it comes to kind of undocumented trans folk is the story of Carolina Lopez. Carolina Lopez is an organizer in Tucson, Arizona, from a Black community on the Southern Pacific coast of Guerrero, Mexico. And she was robbed, and when she went to report the robbery, the police found out she was undocumented in the US and was sent to a detention center. And she was placed in solitary confinement for being trans, and because she didn't pass at the time, they argued that she was safer in solitary confinement than amongst other community members. And I think about safety in that way. And one of the ways in which she began to practice refusal is when she was detained, she had the option to continue taking hormones, and she decided not to, as a form of refusal of what neoliberal safety is amongst the detention center. She was in detention for 3 years. When she was released, she continued to go to that detention center every week to visit the people that she met inside. Mind you, she was undocumented, so every time she entered the detention center, she could be arrogated again by the nation state and sent back into that center. And for me, that is one of the most clear ways of what it means to imagine a future while undocumented, while trans, while Black, and it is to face that same prison every single week in your like local city. And for me, that is a form of an imagination that really destabilizes settler colonialism. And it is what creates this form of like settler fear or settler anxiety of we need to contain Black trans people because they are hyper imaginative subjects who utilize refusal to contradict the liberal democracy.
I just want to ask you to go a little bit deeper in that, because I didn't mention earlier, right, that, the Center for the Study of Black Life and the Law and obviously Mitchell Hamline are based in, Minnesota, which was formerly the Wisconsin Free Territory, which is obviously stolen land from various different indigenous nations. And so you're talking about settler colonialism. I knew we were going to get there eventually, but I think it's important to note, right, that this is about 5 miles from our campus is where Dred Scott was held, when Wisconsin was still a free territory, not only held, right, but held by Union members of the Army, right, that are kind of enforcing and gearing up for a war about the idea of freedom. And at the same time, Indigenous folks are still being displaced. So I wonder if you had some thoughts about how this kind of rhetoric, right, of freedom works, right, to create these spaces of unfreedom. And I would bring it to another place. You don't have to address this and we can talk about it later. But I'm also thinking about Frederick Douglass and his Aunt Hester in the Bloodstained Gate, right? And what type of violences are required to even create a notion or a rhetoric or a serviceability of the notions of freedom.
Oh my goodness, what a question. Freedom requires occupation in the United States because citizenship is a contract between the nation state and the alleged citizen. The nation state says, I will protect you as long as you go to war for me, you carry certain narratives about what the US is, and as long as at the end of the day, you never contradict me. And when you then insert folks who have never been protected by US citizenship, which is like Indigenous communities in the connected 48 settler states, those whose histories, those whose peoples arrived because of slavery and indentured servitude, such as the Chinese diasporic folk, African diasporic folk. these communities have never been able to buy in on the concept of freedom because in order for freedom to exist, they need to be in positions of subjugation. When it comes to undocumented social movements, what freedom is for the non-Black migrant is drastically different than freedom for the Black migrant. It reminds me of, there's a talk that Fred Moten gave in 2015 at a Contemporary Museum of Art, where he resurrects the case of Betty, who was an enslaved woman in a plantation in Tennessee. She was traveling with the slaveholders, the Swedes, to Massachusetts. Abolitionists took Betty to court because they wanted to fight for her freedom. And she was offered her freedom, and then she decided to go back to Tennessee to the plantation. And this became a scandal in the legal archive of what Black freedom is, because abolitionists couldn't fathom that there was a larger freedom than the paper freedom of like, oh, you get free freedom papers, right? For Betty, freedom papers meant nothing because a piece of paper was never going to protect her. Abolitionists didn't think about the fact that this means she can't be amongst her kin in Tennessee. What might it mean to envision freedom in the subjugation, in the plantation? Abolitionists couldn't do that. So when it comes to contemporary undocumented Black migrants, they have a vision of freedom that surpasses the US nation state. For a lot of Black migrants, they don't want to stay in the US, they want to go back home, which means that the US needs to stop their imperial projects in their home countries. And, like American Indians in the US, a lot of them are not federally recognized, and they experience a form of undocumentedness that undocumented migrant experience. American Indians have only been citizens of the US for 99 years. This June will be the 100th anniversary of the American Indian Citizenship Act of 1924. So that also brings into the question, the way that the law organizes Black life depends on settler conquistador mechanisms of how to organize Indigenous life.
Because those that are ordered as citizen, right, have to have a mirror, right? And they operate as a lesson of this is what good comportment can give you. And if you don't act right, we'll also give you violent lessons of comportment. But for the rest of this discussion, I just want to open it up and let everyone bounce off each other. I might have some interventions or comments, but I've seen all of y'all's thinking and thoughtful faces before, and I see them whirling. So go ahead, and I'll also say to the folks in the chat, feel free to drop a comment in the chat or in the Q&A, use your emojis and things. We are Black, y'all. We believe in a call and a response, a little affirmation or a clapback. It's a beautiful thing. And of course, if you do have, what time is it? If you do have questions, feel free to raise your hand if you want to vocalize those as well. But I open it up to the rest of the panelists to bounce around and do your thing.
So can I wanted to ask two questions actually for the panel, because we're talking about this conversation through a Black and queer lens, but I always like to start with the question of what are we considering queer here? I mean, I happen to think that everyone Black is queer. And so I want to engage with that. And I also want to kind of think about when we talk about the state of Black life. And I really thank you so much, Dr. Glover, right, for thinking about our orientation to futurity, right? And this idea of, a healthy skepticism, right? Because there is this propensity, right, to categorize all skepticism as Afro-pessimism. But there also is a right, I believe, for folks who have experienced, who have memory, right? We have memory for a reason, right? To remember what has happened and to be skeptical and to be critical and to be analytical, because what has happened has happened. And I want to kind of push on that a little bit, because I don't think that everything that we think of as kind of pessimistic is necessarily Afro-pessimism, right? I think there are a lot of ways that
Dr. Jackson,
yes.
Can you for a moment, a lot of the girls don't have a PhD in Black studies or political science. These are law students too. So a lot of people don't know what Afro-pessimism is. So can you give a little?
Oh, you want me to do it? The political scientists?
Yeah, go ahead. You know what it is. The Black feminist.
Dr. Glover, tap in, baby.
Look over there. No, I'm kidding.
What's this? Come on.
No, Afro-pessimism, again, I don't want to be too rudimentary here, but Afro-pessimism is, I think, a particular kind of orientation, if you will, to white Western modernity. it is a kind of ontological or ontoepistemological critique. Okay, so again, okay, Dr. Wilson, I see you. Epistemological, what I mean when I say that, it is a critique of the way that we understand knowledge, and it is also a critique of how we've come to understand this thing called being, right? Being, the way that we've understood largely is, understood through the body, right? So Afro-pessimist critiques both ways of knowing, right, that are based are fundamental to white Western modernity, and it critiques, the way that white Western modernity has also understood being. That's one of the best ways I think I can say that. To take it a step further, many Afro-pessimists do believe that, the structuring logics, if you will, of this world, there is no reform, there is no kind of assimilation possible through which Black people will ever be inculcated into the American social fabric, right? Not just that, but many folks take it a step further and say that, therefore, these systems, for them to, they need to be wholly dismantled, one, and also would say that Black folks must be vigilant about divesting these particular systems, right? And that is, again, a critique, if you will, of many of the kind of social movements, particularly in the US, that we're familiar with, right? Going all the way from, a more contemporary example of Black Lives Matter, right? All the way back to civil rights movement, and also, okay, for abolitionist movements as well. So again, I can stop there about Afro-pessimism. Dr. Jackson, just wanted to say a little bit, about, to just engage what you were saying a little bit more.
Yeah.
One of the funny things that this orientation, this beautiful suspicion, has really allowed me to see is the freedom practices that I'm speaking about in this book, none of them are new. None of them are new. I'm giving a new lens, but again, many of the examples that I use come from folks in history. Do you understand? So again, one that I'm thinking of in particular is William Dorsey Swann.
Yes.
William Dorsey Swann. Yes. Okay, so again, one of the people, now understood, born, a slave, right, to become America's first, what we now consider, drag queen. Okay, a formerly enslaved person. Very different knowledge than what folks think. And again, that wasn't the only thing that William Dorsey Swann did. They were also a very clear kind of activist. So, in the chapter that I'm writing about multiplicity, I'm speaking about, and again, this person, William Dorsey Swann, is born 1868.
Right.
Okay, so again, this is a time way before any of the kinds of activism that we think of, right? So again, another example, Dr. Jackson, that Black people are always already queer.
Always.
And it's just about sexuality. It's not just about gender. It's not just about sexuality. It's not just about those things. It is about those things. And also it is about an orientational relation, right? That we have here. So
wait. So just Julian, you touched that, but Dr. Josh, can you get into it too? And others, if they want to jump into it. But the question from an anonymous question was for you, Dr. Jackson, on why you believe that every Black person is queer. They say, I asked this question because a significant amount of homophobia experienced as a minority comes from within our Black community. For example, my own grandma once said that gays go to hell. So like, what does it mean to be queer in this context?
Okay, so first I'm gonna say thank you so much for extending the question on Afro-pessimism, and also to say a lot of the intersections with young Black folks' orientation to their own protection and safety aligns with what we would call Afro-pessimism, and they also see themselves in the future. So we have to think differently about those containers. And I think we should definitely engage with that. Now, in terms of queerness, right? I come from the Kathy Cohen school of thought, right? And this is a school of thought that asks us to move from a place of expansiveness, capaciousness, abundance, right? I believe that Black folk are inherently abundant, right? We hold so much, so multitudes, right? And so unfortunately, when folks hear the term queer, they don't move toward the multitudes, they move toward the limits. They move toward, oh, well, that must mean I'm in this box. And what I say when I'm talking about queerness, I'm asking us to move away from the heteronormative, cisgender, heteropatriarchal ideas of what queerness is. Queerness that is manufactured by institutions that seek to exclude and ask not to have to take care of certain folks because they're outside of these pseudo Judeo-religious constraints, right? Those ideas of queerness are meant to do harm and to identify some folks as citizens and some folks outside of what is proper citizenship. When we talk about queerness, right, we are talking about folks who fall out of the normative, who actually are the majority of us, right? So Dr. Glover again says, as we know, queerness is not just who you lay down with, it's who you wake up as, right? Who are you in the world? What is your orientation to power? How do you engage in a political idea of what you want to be? What is your worldview? And I know folks don't like the word queer because of the stigma, but we have to, we are at big ages. We are at big ages, okay? So we have to move beyond the very surface and superficial frames that frankly political folks have attached and affixed to these words and start thinking more deeply about what it means for us to build camaraderie and coalitions with other folks who sit outside of those normative nuclei that are often harmful to us. The people who are not white, the people who are not male, the people who are not cisgender, the people who are not heterosexual, people who are not middle and upper class, right? There are so many of us. We are all queer, right? But specifically, I say Black folk are queer, and this is where people get real upset with me, because we don't align with any of those structures. We're not from here. That's like, first of all, we from outer space. But beyond that, like I also come from the Spiller school of thought, right? We were brought here and asked to transport ourselves through this liminal space, the oceanic space that we were suspended over. Our names, our knowing, our self-knowing was removed, wiped away, and we were given American grammar. And now we wear it as if it is ours. So when our grandmothers tell us we're going to hell, when our cousins and so say, well, you can't be in the family no more because you sleeping with your friend or whatever, they are not speaking from a place of inner self-knowing and authenticity. They're speaking from a reproduction of systems that also do them harm. And we have to really start thinking, again, more capaciously about who we are and what we actually are internalizing about ourselves, right?
Yes,
so
yes.
That's what queerness is for me.
Absolutely. I concur with Dr. Jackson. Let me also just extend it further and say that, Dr. Jackson is providing evidence to say that there are many folks, many Black folks, right, who are attached to these ideas, right? This heteronormative kind of world, right? And we know that attachment, first of all, causes delusion, okay? And secondly, it is about safety. It is about, people feel as if we can be inculcated into this normative kind of society, then it will somehow protect us from experiencing violence. When we know in many different kinds of ways and with many examples that are endless, that is simply not the case, right? No matter how well, I'll give you one of my favorite examples. No matter how well many of my Black trans femme sisters pass, the propensity and the potential for violence is always there.
I want to come to you, Mycall, but I also just want to kind of note here that we're talking about different types of queerness, right? We're talking about queer as an invaded body, right? In a space that we're not necessarily historically indigenous to, right? Where, as the old church folks used to say, come on, help me, Dr. Glover, I'm in this world, but I'm not of it.
Of this world, right?
Come on. But I mean, there's that type of queer, right? And then we're also talking about a political queer that is a refusal of the social order, right? Well, we're think about a William Dorsey Swan or Essex Hemphill and all of us and Audre Lorde, right? These particular type of people that said, actually, I stand in the gap, right? I stand as a blockade, a type of refusal, or even as Hartman would say, a type of living otherwise, right? As if this world did not exist, because I am who I am and I'm centering my own being, not who I was made to be, not who my grandmama said I must be if I don't go to hell, but who I know I am, following this politics and practice of the erotics that is following your own pleasure principle. Shout out to my mother, Janet Jackson, right? And demanding, right, that the world bend to who I am, as opposed to allowing myself to be circumcised, to be beaten down, right, into this kind of bite-sized way that the world accrues value from me. So I kind of just wanted to situate that a moment, because there is, I think, as you and Dr. Jackson was saying, this notion of kind of Blackness as queerness, because Blackness always already stands outside of the social order. But then there's Black queerness that does a particular type of intramural work within the Black space, right? Because some of us are queer of Black, and that's a whole nother conversation. But I think all of this goes to say, I'm going to come to you next, Mike. I know you had your off mute, but I think all this goes to say, when we think about what is the status of Black queer life in the law, that Black queer life always already is against the law, right? Against the law in terms of illegality, but against the law insofar as that the law requires a particular type of disciplining and devouring and disappearing, as Angela Davis tells us, right, of not just the Black queer body, but as Dr. Glover was telling us, Black queer being, Black queer desire, as Dr. Jackson was saying, Black queer dreams, as, you know, Dr. Lopez was also telling us, this idea of the Black queer body as a boundary-making body, right? The idea that you can have a borderland, right? That you can have even an imagination of a border without the requirement of safety, without the Black body as a fear-mongering sit-in, is quite nuts. But back to you, Mycall. Go ahead, give it to us.
I honestly forgot what I was going to say initially, but I did want to respond for a second. Dr. Glover and Dr. Jackson, I just really appreciate the things you were stating. I also want to go back to the first question about the person being like, hey, what does this mean for me? I've learned a lot of like queer antagonism and homophobia from like Black folks, like who are maybe connected to you. I just want to say, as someone else who was also like raised in the Black church, like my father is a Kojic pastor, right? I just want to be really clear that like, I hear, and that question was anonymous, and whoever's in the space, I hope you're still here. I just want to be clear that like how beautiful it is for you to like begin to ask those questions and to interrogate that, and how scary that might feel. And we're talking a lot of theory, and I think that's really beautiful. But I also want to remember that like, when I remember the first time I heard the term queer, I was like, oh, that's not me, right? Let me be the easiest, most palatable Black and gay kind of person I can. But the idea of queerness was something that was somewhat scary, not even somewhat, but scary to me. So having to like push against those spaces is just like it takes a lot of work. And I hope you're in a community that can like help you both like in the academy and all these theorists and scholars and thinkers that are there, but just people who can love on you as you maneuver through that, because it's not easy, right? And I just want to appreciate that person saying that. It doesn't feel good to be like, yeah, my grandma thinks I'm gonna go to hell. Like, to hold that in you, in your body, I know for myself, was like a lot of work. I also just think about the ways that, hegemony, white supremacy are so insidious, in the ways that I feel queerness has become packaged so simply that it's supposed to be a particular one way, and how often I see students and folks out of schools oftentimes bringing up queerness and be like, oh, that person's not queer because they don't have an undercut. Where's their septum piercing? Where are these like really simple markers of queerness? Has nothing to do about a politic, has nothing to do about anything. It just means they had enough money to buy the 130 pair of Doc Martens with, green laces or whatever. And I see oftentimes queerness being whittled to something like that. And I don't think it isn't for naught that like it happens that way, that it's these little small markers that has very little to do with any kind of structure. And I see this with a lot of our white queer folk, but I also want to be clear with like our Black queer folk too, right? In the ways that when we see, Black queer folks from the diaspora whose maybe their queerness is different, they're like, what, that's not this. And I think we quickly, even when we try to get to the vastness of queerness, it becomes whittled down really quickly. And I'm always hoping to push against that, knowing that it's really difficult, knowing that it's a lot to swallow. And I just wanted to name that really quickly.
Dr. Lopez, did you have go ahead, Julian, did you have
Mycall, thank you so much. Like, I did not know that you two grew up COGIC. Like, that's at least 3 of us just from the panelists.
I mean, I didn't know that, but I knew that about all of you because like there's a certain je ne sais quoi with the, you know.
Yeah, I had to say that. I mean, and you know, like it's important. I mean, of course, we have the theoretical side as well, as Mycall, you pointed out, and there's also the kind of like practical kind of human side. And you know, for me, like understanding, like I'm starting to come out when I was sexually queer and gender queer, like what? I've been out in those ways for the majority of my life now. And what I've realized is that, you know, while I've been, you know, a trans femme for a long time, like being part of ballroom really like limited as much as it, you know, expanded my understanding of what was possible in terms of a Black queer life. Because up to the point that I got introduced to ballroom, all I knew is that Black queer, Black gay, Black lesbian meant death by proximity to HIV and AIDS, right? So again, seeing for the first time possibilities of what Black queer life looked like was really important for me when I saw it. And because these communities exist within the world that we live in, it means that these communities are not immune to having particular kinds of weaknesses, right? And for me, one of the weaknesses that caused me to take a step back from ballroom to really truly understand myself came around this topic of what it means to be trans, right? And the particular ways that transness, you know, in those kind of spaces gets very limited and gets very siphoned off, you know, and defined by, you know, or in relation to white Western norms, white Western standards of, you know, what an aesthetic is and what it can do. And again, what are those based on? Those are based on this idea that there is an aesthetic that one can achieve that will ensure our safety. And my Black queer life, like I told you, has, you know, demonstrated that that is not the case. 1, and 2, that actually transness, my transness, has been just as much, if not more, about an ongoing spiritual and emotional transformation as it has an aesthetic transformation as well, right? So again, I think that there's a way that we, you know, I'm trying to develop a language to which we might be able to like understand these things simultaneously, right? And this goes, I think, to one of the first kind of questions, Dr. Wilson, that you know was directed to myself in the panel about, you know, these party kind of political party affiliations. Well, again, like I said, like attachment, I see these political party affiliations as about attachment. And for me, if attachment causes delusion, then there's a very particular way that having, you know, these kinds of politics or having an affiliation with a political party will cause a kind of delusion, you know, that I think really, the intersectionality really collapses in some really important ways. And I think intersectionality is not just a theory, it is also a practice. We forget that Kim Crenshaw was writing specifically, right, based on the fact that there were Black women who were not getting hired at General Motors, right? For a number of different reasons, right, that affected them in ways that did not affect other people. So I'll stop there. Though I know.
So I want to do 2 things. One, I want to read the question, just respond to, because I know the rest of the audience can't see it. I don't know, the panelists, you should all be able to see the questions that are coming up. So that question was to Dr. Glover and everyone else, how do you perceive the intersectionality of Black life? And to what extent do you believe political party affiliations, I feel you come in, Jen, shape or influence diverse perspectives within the Black community? And after we answer this question, I want to bring one of my RAs and favorite students, Isaac Manchenko, up to be able to kind of ask their question live. But that was our next question that came up there.
Okay, so I definitely want to answer this question. I was thinking about this before the call started, but I also want to rip a really small, tiny little piece of something that was about the last question. And it's because I do realize we are giving like all this high theory, and I want to go back. Thank you, Mycall, for grounding us in our bodies and in our actual humanity as queer subjects, to say like, oh, it's hard, and we went through it. And I will say to that first question about, your grandmother making comments about, queerness being the route to hell, right? I think there's a way where when you're an older queer and you've been queering for a long time, you kind of are like, you get a little Teflon and then you're like, right? But those first couple of times that happens, it hurts. I also grew up in the church. My grandmother was a pastor and I was a queer bodied child. I'm 6'4", and I was a very masculine child. And the fear of death for me that my mother was very, very adamant about protecting me from was that she didn't understand what was happening with my body. So being a queer, gender nonconforming kid in Oakland, California, but also being very, very tall and very shapely, people were very confused as to what to do with me. And I drew a lot of male attention from adult men. And it was a very violent time. It was a very scary time. So my mother's tool set was stay in the house, right? Stay away from these people. And I felt really I felt imprisoned. I felt like I didn't get to go out play outside. I couldn't do what the other girls could do, right? So my queer body also in a lot of ways took away some of my childhood. And so I understand, right, what it's like to move and have the tool set that your parents and grandparents, aunts, uncles, and folks around be so limited because they don't know exactly how to keep you alive, right? And it's hard, right? Because sometimes it comes out like you're going to hell, right? Because they don't have anything else besides, I have to warn you because I don't know if you'll survive. And I'm trying to keep you from being harmed. And so that's not to justify, right, those actions, but it is to say our caretakers often don't know what to do to keep us here. And they often do harm when they're trying to keep us safe.
Can I add to that, Jenn?
Yeah.
Because one thing you're reminding me of is like obviously the kind of like protective, I don't want to say ignorance, but it's because it's also a type of wisdom, right, that our grandmothers and grandfathers do. But I think there's the other side of it too, that one side that you've been, I think the other side that I've experienced is that if your grandparents or parents have to confront the reality of your own sexual and gender identity freedom practice and freedom being, that also means they have to confront the violences that they've experienced by their mother and father and partner and siblings and cousins and pastors and the people that treated them best in the world. That's the best treatment they've ever had was a violation.
That's right.
And what does that do to the construction of oneself if your best love ever was still violence, right? And now every time, excuse me, people, you got your ass beat as a child because no one wanted you to go to hell or no one wanted you to go to jail. And let's note that same-sex sex has only been legal since 2003. So for most of half of our lives here on this panel, we've been illegal. So let's think about that too, right? So that if most of your life you've been a crime, a legal crime, and a social crime, and a spiritual crime, and if you're able to be free and I'm able to hold you as whole, then that means my life. My grandmama and mama that might be dead and gone, right? Their memories now sullied. I actually don't know who I am because I've been beaten into submission to some other being. If people would take that and accept that,
right,
what does that do to the psyche?
Right.
And let's be honest, a lot of Black people don't have access to therapy now.
That's why we're all reparenting ourselves. That's why we're all reparenting ourselves.
And parenting our parents.
And parenting our parents.
And we still have to contend with the law. And the law of Black letter law that's promulgated, but the law of staying alive.
That's it.
It's a whole nother.
That's it.
But I know you're going to answer
the other question. So I think the other question was about intersectionality of Black life and political party diversity in the Black community. And so this is a question that I teach this. And one thing that is persistent over one's life, at least in the US, is one's affiliation with ideology and political party. So ideology is what one believes about politics, and what partisanship is the party that one chooses. So ideology, you can be liberal, conservative, somewhere along that valence, and we have a two-party system, winner take all, right? So Black folk are heavily Democratic, and that hasn't changed for a very long time. And so to answer this question, there isn't a lot of diversity in Black communities that would shift folks' orientation toward queer folks in the law. But what I will say that the question around intersectionality is really important, especially as we're thinking about young folk, right? This is the queerest generation in history. And not to say that queer folk didn't exist before. It's just that we weren't measuring it. We didn't have the language for it. Folks weren't as safe as they are now, even though we still are not safe, right? We are in a place now where folks are building communities, folks are building ways to speak about themselves and to build policy around their existence, right? And so this is the first generation where we have young people stepping out and pushing boundaries, line stepping about what it means to be in their bodies and demanding that their governments, their teachers, their parents respond. We have children, 9-year-old children demanding that their schools make gender neutral bathrooms, right? This generation, this young generation is courageous, you know? So I think that when we think about the young folks, like the Black folks that are coming up now, the diversity of ideas that we're seeing is stemming from young people who know who they are, right? Because they're the children of our generation. They're the children of, we were the last queerest generation. We were the queer trans generation that everyone was afraid of. We were the big bad wolves. And we had children and we raised them as free Black children. And now they're here to fuck shit up.
Right. We had us, like, and again, I want to just make sure that it's clear that we, as Dr. Jackson is saying, we're in a lineage, right? You know, they're the kids now, the children now. Then there's our generation, right? And then we have our parents' kind of generation. Well, what about Marsha P. Johnson, right? If we have Marsha P. Johnson, but again, we can even go back. What about, we know what Marsha has done. What about William Dorsey Swan again? You see what I'm saying? Pauli Murray, so many folks, right? And Swan is particularly interesting to me because, of course, during that time, they had drag balls, right? They had to have them in secret, or they chose to have them in secret, okay? And even when the police raided these drag balls, what do you think Swan did? You think Swan was looking for the first exit? No, they ran directly to the door to barricade the door to prevent the police from coming in. So again, we want to talk about, you know, courage, right? This is something that is, you know, ancestral. It is about our kind of lineages and, you know, not just giving honor and paying honor to that, but walking in that particular kind of ancestral power, right? That endows us, you know, that allows us to live a life beyond what is in front of us, right? And what I'm trying to say here, because I see this question about freedom practices, right? Freedom practices, for me, is very much about rendering the different ways that we render our own lives meaningful without necessitating or an appeal to state power for legibility. That's what freedom practice is. You see what I'm saying?
Isaac, I want you to come off camera and ask your question because for my esteemed siblings on the panel, Isaac is one of my RAs and they're going to be applying to some of y'all's PhD programs next year. So I wanted y'all to get a good look and also understand why my book is going to be so fire because I had a great editor and RA commenter over here. So Isaac, please introduce yourself and do your questions. Oh, let me unmute you. Sorry, Sugar. Go ahead. Go ahead one more time. You know I'm old.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. This has been so meaningful and impactful and motivating. But I had been kind of reading about refusal lately and also considering Kathy Cohen's essay and her account of queerness that considers power hierarchies. And when we think of power hierarchies in racial capitalism, which is all capitalism, how does Black queerness offer an important model for thinking through the relation between desires, which I think of as like effective labor, communities, families, and ways of life, and more generally, struggles for social transformation? It's a long question.
Well, can I oh no, Dr. Pelaez Lopez, you go ahead. I've talked a lot, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Isaac. That reminds me a lot of the work of Dr. Dora Silva Santana, who is a trans scholar from Northern Brazil. And she has this beautiful article titled Mais Viva translating as more alert, more savvy. And she introduces it as a method in which of how Black trans women resist in Brazil. And Mais Viva is this idea that that you have to hold an analysis of the violence, but also insist on your joy. And when you do both of them, you become more alert at the reality and the geography that you're in, but you also become more savvy, which means more imaginative, more abundant. And I feel that like that is a form of like Black optimism that seriously considers Afro-pessimism, uses it to kind of like architect a fugitive escape, and then insist on a something outside of death, which is aliveness. But, you know, I think that in organizing spaces, the question that you bring up about refusal and power hierarchies, no matter who we are, we always have to realize that we might not always be the most oppressed person in the room. And I think that refusing this idea that Black queerness and Black transness is inherently oppressive is like necessary. There is nothing oppressive about being Black and queer or being Black and trans. It's actually like incredible. What is oppressive is how modern empires, specifically the US utilizes queerness and transness through an Anglophone framework that sees it as like standard. But when you look at like the hemisphere, queerness and transness is so much more expansive than the Anglophone way. And we have to refuse Anglophone understandings of queer and trans in order to really get to the textures of Black life.
Can I also say, Dr. Lopez, Isaac is also reading your anthology right now. So I wanted to make sure I made the connection between your wonderful work and also the work that Isaac has been working on and doing. And I think it's been informative. So I just wanted to put that out there because your work is in the world, baby. Dr. Jackson?
I love that so much. Like, and there were so many words that I thought were so important. But one of the ones I was hoping would come out, and it did, was abundance. And I think that I was thinking when I saw the question about this moment of pleasure activism that has really become a moment of theoretical intervention and empirical work and scholarship, where so many queer folks, especially queer academics and organizers, are thinking about the ways that the work that they do to, in a lot of ways, support these predominantly white institutions, these extractive institutions, extract so much labor and energy from them, but pours nothing back. And what they've said is we're taking ourselves back. We're doing intentional work to ensure that we, a part of our activism includes our pleasure, not only includes but centers our pleasure. And that requires moving from a place of abundance, not scarcity, right? But we are socialized into scarcity. Capitalism is scarcity. Everything about what we are raised in is scarcity. And I love your response, Dr. Lopez, because I think that that's exactly the issue when we think about how queerness is framed from that Anglophone framework that you're talking about. It's from a position of scarcity, but we are not scarce, right? We are not lacking, right? And I think that to answer your question about desire and community, that's the beautiful thing about queerness, transness, disability, our orientations, our multiple intersections, is that we are capacious, we are expansive, we build our own communities, we build our own families, and we are allowed to explore our desires because we're not hampered by those definitions and those structures that are so limiting and so scarce. And I think that's what I've actually had to learn, right? That was the hardest, I think, lesson to unlearn, was that lesson of scarcity, because it's so persistent and it's everywhere. Mm-hmm. And you learn it as a part of labor and education, but you don't realize how much of it comes into your own ethos and your identity.
So I know there might be more answers to this, and I want to add y'all's answer to that question with this other question that's in the chat. So one, people are asking for social media, and if folks feel comfortable sharing that, put that in the chat. That's neither here nor there. Folks want to learn more from you. But there's a second question, and then I will ask a closing question, but you can answer these in any way you want. So the other anonymous question says, a recent NPR politics podcast I listened to prompted me to ask, how do you feel the growing Christian nationalism movement and the current House Speaker's support of it? How do you think it will affect Black rights and Black growth? Additionally, do you think movements like these are similar to traditional patriarchal male-dominant beliefs, such as the Proud Boys, or are they closer to the Aryan Nation movements?
For me, it's repeating same.
What's that?
For me, it's the repeating kind of same. I mean by that is to say that there is a, seems like every few years, the same kinds of modes of white supremacy, right, of patriarchy, right, of cis heteronormativity, try on something new, try on a new look, and grant themselves a new name by which they're going to do the same bidding that they have done for a long ass time. And so for me, this is yet another iteration of that, and I think that there's a way that, like I said, once we really see that this is really a part of the same kind of thing that has been going on for a long time, I think that, it's good to know that. And of course it will have a kind of, effect on Black folks and Black growth. But again, like, as Dr. Jackson has said, that we, as these communities are so capacious that and so creative that no matter what it is that is being thrown at us, many times we are far along, far ahead, and certainly know how to know how to navigate these kinds of things in a way that I think that gives me a particular kind of, allows me to rest at night, and not be afraid, because I think that many folks want people to be afraid, right? What other reason do you have, we know that fear is something that can really control people, or that is used to control a lot of folks. And I think that this is yet another iteration of that. It doesn't scare me any more than, what is going on with our climate. Do you see what I'm saying? So I think that there's a lot that I could say, but I'll stop there.
I would just add on the legal side, and I want the other folks to answer this as well, just to kind of bring it back to the law. It's important for us to remember and read things like the Federalist Papers. The Federalist Papers are very, very clear about the founding white supremacist, rapist, anti-Black, enslaving, cis heterosexist, genocidal maniacs that we call the founding fathers that created this country. And they're very clear in that document about their views on women as being extension of their own property, on their views of enslaved Africans as not being human, but being an admixture of property and humanity only insofar as it allows, right, a particular type of tax and electoral scheme that our census is still based on, that the makeup and the calculation of our Senate and our House are still based on, that our very tax structure in this country is based on. So when Saidiya Hartman talks about the afterlives of slavery, and I put the link in the chat, we're talking about Federalist 54, right? And how the Constitution, the Federalist Papers, and the notion of precedent act as the living will, as the repeating, precedential, governing logic, the living will of the founding fathers. And so if you read these early documents, not just the Constitution, read that too. Read your Magna Carta. Read the Federalist Papers. It's the same thing over and over. And I say this all the time, and I don't mean to be offensive, but there's no one more idiotic and simple and basic than a white supremacist. There's no new idea. You're doing it over and over again, and you're not that good at it. We've seen the story. It's like, watching Scream 17 or something. Like, once you've seen Scream 1, you know the script, right? So I'll leave that at that. But I want to let the other panelists answer this question. I know we're getting up on time. I have one more question if y'all will indulge me. But please, get into this.
I love that. My answer is very short. Whenever I think about this kind of thing, this kind of question around the resurgence of a thing, I think about Theo Goldberg's book, The Threat of Race. And in the book, he talks about how racism has never actually changed. It just transforms with technology and with time. And so what we see each generation is just It's the myth-making practice and process of white supremacist institutions that are made to make us think that something new is happening. That's what they're trying to do. They're trying to use the short human memory, and they're hoping we'll just forget that we just did this. I saw a meme about this online, and it was like, how do y'all keep doing the same thing? It's like you're flunking the test and the notes it's an open book test. We just did this, right? So I say that to say, you know, while sure we're seeing the ebb and flow, which we see every few decades, right, of a conservative movement, right? It's actually a pendulum-like swing that you can measure if you just kind of look back the last 60 to 80 years. A resurgence that's on the heels of a moment of a lot of liberationist policy, right? There was a moment where people was like, oh, we free. We elected Barack Obama. We living good. We high on the hog. And the white supremacists came up out from underneath they troll with them troll bridges, and they was like, not today. Not today. Not today. So you know, am I concerned? I'm concerned that folks aren't doing their homework. But what I'm not concerned about the young folk, right? The young folk are aware. The young folk were not surprised when Trump was elected, and they haven't been surprised one time in the last 10 years at anything that has happened politically. So I think if we listen to the young folk, we have nothing to be afraid of.
Mycall, Alam, thoughts on this? No? Okay, so there might be, did you want to say something, Mycall?
I was just saying I'm good.
Okay. So I just wanted, and I know we're just a couple minutes over time, and y'all know how I feel about time and time being money, and also my peace and rest. But I do want to ask this, since we are talking to predominantly law students and future lawyers, and there's a huge responsibility there. We're talking about the state of Black queer life in the law, but also through a Black queer lens. And so I would ask you if you did have some kind of practical advice. How do folks go about regarding, right, Black queer living in life, in joy, but also death and proximity to violence in their legal practice, whether you're an immigration attorney, whether you're a defense attorney, a public defender, you're legal aid, you're a prosecutor, you're a corporate attorney, right? What are the things that if folks take nothing else from this conversation, if you could give nothing else to these junior scholars and future senior scholars of law, policymakers and people that are going to be practicing law, what should they take? Or judges, right? How should they be interpreting the law with our livelihood in mind, but also knowing they're up against the law? What do we leave them with?
I think one of the things is to refuse to normalize legally progressive legislation, because often than not, what we see as progressive is always dependent on the taking away of somebody else's rights. So to get into the habit of not necessarily celebrating progress, but always questioning what we're missing in the larger picture, because that is, I think, where we fail as either organizers or practitioners in being too celebratory progress.
Yeah, I like that. One of the things I ask my students in every class is, okay, this is the law, so where's the lie? Right, and where is the Black in Black letter law? So thank you for kind of re-instantiating that, because I think that we get really happy when we pass, marriage equality. But where's the equality in marriage? Mycall, go ahead, bring us in.
Someone told me once, I don't remember who it was at some conference, blessed are the shit talkers.
Amen.
I think really, really comfortable with people who are like people we deem as like haters, never happy, that kind of person. Getting connected, maybe even becoming a little bit of that can be really useful. Sitting with the fact, and I know Dr. Lopez, you already touched on this, but sitting with the fact of like the general, like, oh, we did it, stopping right there to then think of who is now on the margins of the thing that we did, and to understand, and maybe this feels like a little corny, but like understand the container we're sitting with. It's built this, like it's not going to do it right. We're working in these historically white institutions. We're working in spaces that are queer antagonistic from its inception. They're not broken. They're not, this didn't just happen. They've built this way. And to understand what it means to be someone kind of situated in like a container that's deeply flawed all the time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Can I chime in here?
Go ahead.
So something I think about all the time. I mean, I did not go to law school. I have a lot of comrades who did, and something I've witnessed in Chicago with the passing of the reparations ordinance was a lot of folks who use their training from their law experiences, their experiences in law school, their experiences in their practices, to write an ordinance that actually ended up paying out reparations to folks who had previously been tortured and incarcerated due to John Berg's long time, 30-year or so time where he actually was taking folks off the street and had a whole system of institutional structural harm against Black folks on the South Side. So I say that to say, be a quilter, right? If you believe in this work, if you believe in liberation, if you believe that there is a lie, right, that there's an inherent myth in this promise, right, of American democracy, liberty, and justice for all, right? Then be a quilter, bring folks together to not just try and, do the traditional law work, do the non-traditional thing. Think imaginatively, right? In Chicago, they put together an art project that ended up being reparations, right? Do something beautiful, do something outside of those boxes, because that's where we find our freedom. We're not going to find it in those same boardrooms where they took our freedoms away. That's not where it is.
Thank you. Dr. Glover.
So, Dr. Wilson, I really love this notion of when you said, this is the law, where is the lie? So, and I'll extend that and say that, if the law is built on a lie, then that means it has become, an expert practitioner of deception. So that means then we too must become expert practitioners of deception, or have a fugitive relationship to deception. And what I mean by that is simply to say, develop a way of understanding and a relationship to the law that allows you to render your own life and the lives of your clients or those who are most important to you, renders meaningful their lives at whatever expense or whoever's expense it might be, because the law has certainly done that to us and will continue to do that to us. And I think one of the best ways we can deal with that is to develop a kind of fugitive kind of relationship or fugitive practice of deception in relation to or with regard to the law.
Thank you for that. And lastly, I'll just say that it's really important for all of us to kind of think about, particularly those that are practicing law, thinking about doing scholarship in and around law, that you have to get to a space where Black and Black queer life is more than mere matter, right? Where it's more than mere fodder, or as Toni Morrison would say, cannon fodder, right? That fuels the system that we live in. And you have to get to a moment where you're not only thinking about the lie beneath the law, but also being a good witness, right? About everything that you've experienced in your entire life. All the things your partners, whether you can stand them or not, hello, because some of them ain't, and we ain't gonna go there. People in your family, right? And think about your lived experience as a collection of data, as a collection of irrefutable facts that the law has to stand against. So don't think about the law as this kind of fact-finding mission that you put your experience up against, that you have to prove your life's worth. You have to prove your life's history, your mother's history, what have you, but do the inverse. Make the law go to work, right? And be aware that the law is oftentimes a collection of very bad white supremacist poetry, right? And so what do you do with it? How do you bear good witness? How do you wield the law? Because it's a sword, right? That can either be used for you or against you. So I just encourage us all to remember, those of us that are in the practice or the scholarship or the undoing of law, to remember that the law has a life beyond the courtroom. It has a life of assembling and disassembling Black and Black queer life. It has a life of ordering and disordering the ways in which Black queer people live and die every single day, and not just, going to the grave, but spiritually, economically, emotionally, right? And so we have to think about the violence that the law constructs and reconstructs for all people across race and gender from the womb to the tomb. And be a good witness to that. And lastly, I'll say, and y'all are probably tired of hearing me say this. Y'all know I went to Howard Law School, child. But as Charles Hamilton Houston would say, the legal architect of the civil rights movement, a lawyer is either a social engineer or a parasite on society. Which one are you? And that's the question I leave you with. So I hope you'll all join me in thanking our wonderful and esteemed panelists for joining us tonight and going 15 minutes over time. So I know they're tired and busy, most of y'all on the East Coast. So thank all of you for joining us. They've put their information in the chat. Please be in contact. These are the most generous and brilliant people that I know. So with that, I bid the rest of you good night. And we will see you all soon. Take care, children.
Thank you all. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Good night.
Night.